In this video, we will be continuing where we left off in the previous video and be completing this hair by creating the backside. To start off, I will be creating a new collection for the back hair so that we can work separately from our bangs. I will make the bangs here unselectable so that we do not accidentally pick any of the objects, but we still get to see them. I'll also hide the proxy or the link duplicate of our bangs, since we don't really need it for any purpose right now. And then in our world space origin, within our back hair collection, I will be adding in a mesh cylinder. I'll reduce the vertex count to 4 so that it is easier to subdivide or add the edge loops. I will rotate by 45 degrees on the z-axis. And then I'll create a rough shape out of the hair. I'll disable the topology overlay for now. When aligning the top face of the cylinder to the character's scalp, it helps to have a roughly even distribution of faces, where the face size is more or less continuous. It doesn't have to be perfect, as long as there aren't any outlying faces, you should be fine. But still, it is a good idea to make sure that it is as best as possible. As with the previous step, you don't necessarily have to do a great job lining up the mesh so far, since we can always make adjustments after we've added the modifiers. It helps to get a sense of the scale you're working with before you add the modifiers. This is a decent enough stopping point for the shape for now. What I'll do is I'll place the curve profile and the radius proxy curves outside of our banks collection, and I'll be using these as the targets for our parameters with the cylinder as well. You can just define new proxy objects if you'd like, but for the time being I'd rather just save on time. It is not very easy to notice, but if you pay attention here, you can see that the hair cards at the top of the face are aligned such that the pointy part of the profile is sticking outwards, but near where behind the ear is, they're pointing inwards. This is because of how Blender calculates the curve normals for curves that are mostly vertically aligned. So one way to fix this is to rotate your object in object mode, and then within edit mode, making sure that your 3D cursor is set to your viewpoint and is where your object origin is, rotating by the same axis and direction but in the opposite direction. This will not be a perfect fix, it will just make it so that the alignment is lining up with a different axis of the world space. In this case, because of the way we rotate it, it is lining up with the y-axis, but it can help remedy it a little bit. Alternatively, you can also define a new surface object to align the curves normals to, where the curves or the surface that you're aligning to doesn't really have any normals pointing in the same direction as your object space's z-axis. As with the frontal hair, you can create a link duplicate of your cylinder, get rid of all the modifiers, set the viewport display to be wires, and edit this curve. By default, the curves are aligned such that their roots are on one of the flat faces of the cylinder, and the tips go to the other flat face. Now at this point, these faces aren't really flat, but the principle still remains. So if you want the tips of the curves to flare out, you can always use the slide relax tool to expand the tip face. The total vertex count or the control point count of the curves is determined by the resolution of your cylinder object. And we can get rid of this behavior by using a resample curve modifier to make the curves have more resolution than the cylinders themselves. One particular weakness of this workflow is that if we hide this collection, you can see without it we have 37,000 triangles, and with it we shoot up to 56,000. This can be circumvented by just reducing the curve resolution or the curve count, and by making the strands themselves thicker. Our align curves to surface modifier is making some of these curves align with the ear, it seems. In this case, you can either create a separate scalp object and try to align your curves to that. So for example, we could shift E to duplicate this part, expand it, and separate it into a new object. Or alternatively, you can create a vertex group. Assign the vertices that you want to be considered for the alignment. And within your align curve surface modifier, you can specify this vertex group, and the curves will only align to that surface. Since we've only specified the scalp in this case, it does create an issue with the lower parts of the curves. So we can either use propagate root tilt so that the curve's tilt is continuous and only the root point is checked and then apply to the rest of the curve. Or we can always just go to our object and increase the vertex count for the selection. This is one approach you can have to back hair using cylinders to curves. Now I will showcase another approach using the same mesh object but a different combination of modifiers. This isn't really an approach that I use, but it is still a good showcase of how some of the modifiers interact with one another. To start off, I will create a linked duplicate of our collection so that the exact same mesh data is used. This way, if we make any edits to one of them, it will be reflected to the other one as well. By using shape keys, we can make sure that we do not actually lose the edits we make, or rather, the edits we've made before. So now we can make edits in our shape key, which reflect onto our original object, but we can also just undo the edits. I will hide our original collection. And then I will be getting rid of some of the modifiers here. I will keep the cylinders to curves and curve to mesh, and the other ones we will bring back in as we need them. Now I will hide our main body and bangs for now. And for this workflow, I want to edit the modifier so that we only have curves emitted from the outer edge of our top face. Now, depending on how much you edited your cylinder, it might be tricky to find out exactly where the top face begins. This is where the UV editor can come in very handy, because by default, the bottom left corner of the UV grid is dedicated to the top face of the cylinder, and the bottom right corner is dedicated to the bottom face of the cylinder. In fact, this is how the cylinders to curves modifier detects the face to emit the curves from. So you should not make any changes to these UV maps, but you can still use them to very quickly select the vertices you want to select. So I will add in a vertex group and call it density, and assign this outer edge loop to this group. Now, if we press this button, we can use this group to control the density of the curves emitted by our cylinders to curves modifier, so that they're only emitted from the outer faces. Now I'll be adding in a cylinders to curves, or rather curves to for curves modifier. Now, curves to for curves modifier requires a target object to emit the curves from the surface of, but luckily we have our cylinder itself target with this modifier. Now this looks very messy, but this is to be expected because we're going to be adding more modifiers. To start off, I will be toggling off the radius effect on length so that all the emitted curves are of the same length for the time being. Now I will be adding in a align curve to surface modifier. Move it before our curve to mesh. And again, I will be targeting our base cylinder. That way we can control some of these outliers that are very sticking out. Now we can actually set the wrapping group or the wrapping parameters by groups as well. So we can add a tip wrap group, for example. And then on our copy, we can use the editing or the vertex weight tools to adjust the wrapping of the curves locally. We can also control the emission of the fur curves so that the top face and the bottom face aren't emitting any fur curves themselves. Because no matter how much we change the wrapping, this part will always look messy. So let's go ahead and add in a new vertex group and call it fur density. I'll also capitalize this one's name because it's a bit bothering me. Of course, once we change the name here, we will have to update it here as well. Now for our fur density group, I will go to edit mode on our object without the modifier. I will select all the side vertices for now. We can keep changing the weight paint of the tip wrap group, but we can also just completely wrap the curves and then use a displacement modifier to offset them from the surface as well. For the time being, I will just wrap them completely except for maybe the bottom curves. I will add in a resample curve modifier, but mute it for now. We can again target our link duplicate for relative displacement to the surface normals. This is a very high density setup, but we only have 10,000 triangles. This is one advantage of this setup because we do not have any internal triangles. It leaves us with a lot more triangles to work with on the outside of the mesh. As you can see, it also lends itself much more to hairstyles that are a bit more messy. Now, because we're not really emitting any curves from the bottom, I'll go ahead and adjust our fur density group. make sure that we emit from those surfaces as well. We still get this gap in the middle because we need to change the parameters of our cylinders to curves or other curves of our curves modifier and adjust our curve proximity cutoff. I'll just set it to 0. We're still not getting any curves from the top face because we set up the vertex groups appropriately. Now we will have to make some adjustments here because these curves are being wrapped as well. And because they're being emitted from these surfaces, they're basically just crumpling away or being compressed into singular points. Now if we emit our align curve to surface modifier, we can see that without it, the curves stick away and create a pretty decent volume. So we can just adjust our wrapping group. For example, we can just create a new wrapping group entirely. And by setting all the vertices other than the bottom face to this group, we end up with the bottom face not wrapped, but everything else is. With this approach, we do have one problem, however, where the curves that are being emitted from the bottom face are not being wrapped at all, whereas the curves being emitted from these sides are wrapped, and some of their control points are closest to the bottom face, so we end up with these intersecting areas near the bottom of our cylinder. One way to deal with this would have been to adjust the angle parameter of our curves to fur curves, but this can also end up changing the rest of the setup, which is not something I want to do. So by creating a link duplicate of our object without the modifier, we can make changes to our wrap group within weight paint mode. However, as you can see, because we are using the mirror vertex groups option, the blurring isn't really being mirrored. So once we toggle it off, we can just blur these areas until the end result is good enough without any intersections. We can use the low strength adjustments as well. And once we're done, we can just delete the link duplicate. Now, because we have very high density curves, and each curve is relatively high resolution, and the profile itself also has 4 triangles per resolution. This is a pretty high triangle count setup, but we do have a lot of options to configure this as well. We can always just change the count in the example curve modifier. We can change the curve profile object to be a lower resolution. So we can get rid of this vertex, for example. We can reduce the total amount of curves within our the fur curves modifier. And then increase the size of the curves to compensate for this loss of volume. It's all up to you to find your own balance with these setups. Now you can see we do have one problem with the alignment, where the top curves are not really aligning properly with the cylinder. You can make adjustments in edit mode and then rotate the objects back in object mode to sort of combat this. But the main reason this is happening in this particular case is because we are displacing our curves after we have already aligned them. So one way to fix it is to just have another align curve to surface modifier after everything else. And with no wrapping, we target our cylinder again. If there are still outliers, it may be more beneficial to enable propagate root tilt or change the tilt blurring values. You can see it has fixed the issue. You can keep making adjustments to the parameters or in sculpt mode or edit mode to fix out any of the remaining issues. For now, I hope this was a good demonstration of what can be done with the same mesh, but two different approaches to the modifiers. If you have any further questions, feel free to leave a comment or contact me directly for any questions as well as any workflow ideas or suggestions, such as things you would like to see done using these modifiers.